So just want to make a brief video response to Professoranton, offer up a couple points, because he was talking in a video about a book called Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, by Turkle, I believe is the author's name. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, there will be a link in the description to a TED Talk by the author. But I guess most of the points that Professoranton brought up were about the sociable robots, which I have not completed reading the book, but I did read the first few chapters that talked about the sociable robots, so I know what he's saying. But the reason that I guess I find this personally relevant to me, Professoranton is a communications professor, so it doesn't entirely surprise me that he would make a video on this book, but it was particularly relevant to me in particular, for one, making video responses to Feminist Frequency, for one, who made a video about fembots. And what I thought of in regards to that was not that I would challenge the assertion of the sexism of, these beer commercials with, fembot robots with beer kegs in their uterus or anything like that, but rather that it seems to kind of miss the overall point, that it's almost like a secondary, lesser important point to the fact that, as the sort of theme and thesis of this book, that technology and things like robots really are a means by which people distance themselves from each other, and they don't need to have the same level of intimacy. And in the first couple of chapters of this book, it talks about both men and women liking this idea of robots and a robot companion. And there's a line in the description of a guy saying, like, why he would want one of these robots, and I guess in this case it would be a fembot, I would assume, if this is a heterosexual man. And he's saying, he essentially says, because a robot would never disappoint me, would always be there for me. And it reminded me of a line in a Feminist Frequency video where she's talking about the non-violent games on the iPhone, and she says, my iPhone is always there for me. And then she goes on to list contexts like a meeting or being in a line or whatever, waiting in a waiting room, where you might otherwise interact with another human being or take it as an opportunity to interact and communicate with other human beings, and yet typical modern 21st century person just buries their face inside of a screen so that they don't have to communicate. And so communication technologies like the internet, like text messaging, etc., and robots both have this overarching theme that it is a controlled level of intimacy and personal communication, and also control over the terms of the relationship with someone, or in this case a robot, maybe something, where a robot girlfriend or a robot boyfriend is never going to break your heart. They are always going to accept you unconditionally because that's what they're programmed to do. And I think that the point that Alone Together sort of strikes at is that this says more about the human condition than just whether or not, say, fembots or some symbol of misogyny, but rather, speaks more profoundly about human intimacy. And also, in the vein of science fiction, Professoranton ends this video with a line, and I'm paraphrasing here, like, what are you going to think when a robot, your daughter comes home with a robot boyfriend? And it reminded me of a line in the show Caprica, which is a prequel to Battlestar Galactica, where a television presenter is interviewing Daniel Greystone, the creator of the Cylons, as Cylons have just started to take off and gain popular acceptance. And this almost exact same question is posed to him. What about Cylon gardeners, Cylon butlers? What about when my niece comes home with her new Cylon boyfriend, and that sort of thing in the show? And having to spark that recollection, it reminded me that when we talk about robots, Professor Anton poses this question, well, what new territory is this going to open up? And in my opinion, having been a fan of science fiction my entire life, I would have to say that a lot of this territory would seem to be already, in some sense, mapped out. I mentioned Caprica. Of course, Battlestar Galactica is one of the many stories where it's robots uprise and attempt to destroy mankind. The Matrix, Terminator, other examples of that. Lots of Isaac Asimov stories. He had quite a few very popular robot stories, movies like Blade Runner, the book that it's based on by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And so within the domain of science fiction, or as some people prefer to call it, speculative fiction, you already have a lot of this sort of territory mapped out. And lots of movies come to mind with these things already, like AI. Thinking about this book, Alone Together, and the idea of robots taking care of the elderly, it sparked in my mind an idea for a science fiction short story that I think I'm going to attempt to write, because both of my parents have been RNs and have worked in nursing homes. So in my day, I've heard quite a few stories about the elderly and, elderly with dementia and that sort of thing from my parents. And so I think that might actually be comedy gold as a sort of scenario, the senile versus robots, and how these, robots would have to try and cope with, say, somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia or something like that, and how the elderly would react to the robots, because right now the technology is rather primitive, so they can be programmed to have enough of a human-like response to really trick people a bit. But I think maybe if they scratch the surface, they would realize, they would kind of after a while get the swing of what these robots are about and their limitations, and then maybe not be so comforted by them after a certain learning curve. I think that if I was an elderly person, and this is possible in the future, by the time that I'm old enough for the retirement home, that my future children might try and push a robot on me to take care of me, that I would constantly be trying to figure out the parameters of this robot and be coming up with my own variations on the Turing test, just to determine exactly how sophisticated the robot is. I would probably end up playing my own little mind games with the robot. So that would be my personal take on having a robot caretaker. My question for Professor Anton then, to end this video, is that given the terrain as it's been mapped out kind of very imaginatively by science fiction, do you think that any of the science fiction scenarios are very plausible, such as the robots are going to rise up and kill us all, as in any number of stories, or that we'll achieve some sort of Marxist utopia when the robots are doing everything for us, or we'll have robot gigolos like in the movie AI, or will it be like Blade Runner? Are any of these sorts of scenarios with robots at all plausible? And if so, which do you think is the most plausible sci-fi story about robots? So those are my observations. I would definitely say check out Alone Together. I intend to finish reading it, and that's all for now.